In a worn-down neighborhood where money was tight and meals were rationed, 10-year-old Nia Carter was walking home from school when she spotted a man sitting alone at an abandoned bus stop, thin, silent, and too proud to ask for help. Most people walked past without a second glance. Nia almost did too, but she stopped, turned around, and handed him the last thing she had. It was a small act, quiet and unremarkable, except for one thing none of them knew. Tucked inside that wrapping was a piece of paper that would crack open a 3-year conspiracy, bring down powerful men, and send 50 police officers straight to her front door. And it all started because a little girl decided not to keep walking. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The neighborhood where Nia Carter grew up didn't have a name people were proud of. It had a reputation instead, one built from years of neglect, crumbling sidewalks, and corner stores that charged too much for too little. The houses sat close together like they were holding each other up, their paint peeling in long strips, their front yards patchy with dry grass and cracked flower pots that no one got around to replacing. It wasn't an ugly place exactly, but it was a tired one. Nia was 10 years old, and she had lived on Mercer Street her entire life. She knew every crack in the sidewalk between her grandmother's front door and the end of the block. She knew which neighbor's dog barked in the mornings and which one kept a radio going all night. She knew the smell of the bakery 2 streets over that opened at 5 in the morning and how the wind sometimes carried it all the way to her bedroom window if everything was quiet enough. She also knew what it felt like to go to bed a little hungry. That was the part she never talked about at school. There were things you kept to yourself when you were 10, not because you'd been told to, but because you understood, without anyone explaining it, that some truths made people uncomfortable. And Nia had learned early how to carry hers quietly. Her grandmother, Ruth Carter, was a small woman with large hands and an even larger sense of dignity. She was the kind of woman who pressed her clothes before church even when it was too hot, who always answered the phone with a proper hello, who believed that how you carried yourself said more about your character than any circumstances you found yourself in. She had raised Nia since Nia was 3, after her mother left and her father followed, and she had done it with nothing more than a fixed income, a fierce love, and a refusal to let the world define them. On the morning that would change everything, Ruth woke up at 6 and stood in the kitchen for a long time before opening the refrigerator. It wasn't a dramatic pause, just the quiet, practiced calculation of someone who had learned to make small things stretch. 2 eggs, a half-empty bottle of milk, some butter, a little gone at the edges, and one last heel of bread sitting in the bag beside a slice that had gone slightly stiff overnight. She made the bread work. By the time Nia shuffled into the kitchen, still blinking the sleep from her eyes, Ruth had a sandwich wrapped in brown paper sitting on the table, a glass of water beside it, and a look on her face that mixed love with the kind of practical seriousness that came from knowing what day it was, and what was in the refrigerator. "Sit down, baby," Ruth said, already moving back to the stove. Nia sat. She was still in her socks, one of them slightly twisted at the toe. She looked at the sandwich on the table and didn't say anything. "That's the last of the bread," Ruth told her, not turning around. "So, you make it last, you hear me? Don't share it with anyone at lunch just because they ask. You eat the whole thing." "Yes, ma'am." "I mean it, Nia. That has to hold you till dinner." "I know." "To Grandma?" Ruth turned then and looked at her granddaughter sitting at that kitchen table. Small for her age, serious-faced, with those large, dark eyes that always seemed to be taking in more than they let on. Something moved through Ruth's expression that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite worry, but lived somewhere close to both. She crossed the kitchen and pressed her hand to the side of Nia's face for just a moment. "You're a good girl," she said simply. Then she turned back to the stove. Nia picked up the sandwich, held it in her lap for a second, then tucked it carefully into the front pocket of her backpack. She didn't eat it for breakfast. She was saving it. School was its own kind of world, and Nia had long since learned how to move through it without taking up too much space. Her classroom at Hargrove Elementary was loud in the way that most fifth-grade classrooms were loud. The scraping of chairs, the overlapping conversations, the sudden eruptions of laughter over things that weren't always funny. Nia sat near the window, which she preferred because the light came in at a good angle in the morning, and she could see a slice of sky between the buildings across the street. She wasn't unpopular. That would suggest a kind of active rejection that didn't really apply to her. She was more overlooked than anything. The girl who got her work done on time and never caused problems, and therefore didn't attract much attention in either direction. Teachers liked her in the background sort of way that meant they trusted her to handle herself. Classmates orbited around louder, brighter personalities. And Nia was content enough to let them. But she watched. She always watched. She noticed things other kids didn't bother to notice. She noticed that Marcus, who sat in the back row, always had 2 sandwiches and always gave one away to Tyler without making anything of it. She noticed that their teacher, Ms. Holloway, kept a box of granola bars in her bottom desk drawer and offered them quietly, one at a time, to kids who seemed like they hadn't eaten. She noticed that the janitor, a tall man named Mr. Webb, always whistled the same song, something old and low, and that he only stopped when something was bothering him. She noticed these things and filed them away, the way she filed away most things, not because she planned to use them, but because paying attention was just something she did. At lunch, she ate her sandwich alone at the end of a table near the windows. It was good. Ruth had put a little mustard on it, and there was still enough filling to make it feel like a real meal. Nia ate slowly, making it last the way her grandmother had told her to, and when she was done, she sat with her hands folded on the table and watched the rest of the cafeteria without anyone watching back. The afternoon passed the way most afternoons passed. Math, reading, a science worksheet that was finished before the rest of the class. When the bell rang at 3:15, Nia collected her things, put on her backpack, and walked out into the October air, which had gone from cool to cold, somewhere between morning and afternoon. She began the walk home. On the route from Hargrove Elementary to Ruth's house on Mercer Street was about 12 minutes on a direct path, down 2 blocks, left at the gas station, past the dry cleaner and the check cashing place, and the laundromat with the broken sign. Nia had walked it hundreds of times. She knew it the way she knew the crack in the kitchen floor tile and the sound the third stair made when you stepped on it. She was 2 blocks from home when she saw him. He was sitting at the bus stop near the corner of Clement and Fifth, a gray-painted metal bench that had been there for years, even though the bus route that used it had been discontinued. Nobody sat there anymore, usually. The shelter was missing one of its side panels, and the bench had been tagged over so many times the original paint was invisible beneath layers of faded spray. The man was tucked to one side of the bench, his shoulders slightly forward, his coat, too thin for October, pulled tight around him. He was older, maybe late 40s, though it was hard to say because the streets had a way of adding years to a face. His hair was grown out and grayed at the temples, his beard thick and uneven. He had a paper coffee cup on the ground beside him that was empty. His hands rested on his knees, still. What stopped Nia wasn't the way he looked. She had seen people in worse shape than this on these streets. What stopped her was what he wasn't doing. He wasn't asking for anything. Most people in his position, at least in Nia's experience, had some version of the ask. A hand extended, a sign propped against a knee, a voice that called out as you passed. Even the quiet ones usually tracked you with their eyes. The appeal in their expression enough to communicate what they needed. It was human. It made sense. You asked because you needed. This man wasn't asking. He was looking at the ground about 3 feet in front of his feet, and his posture wasn't dejected so much as removed, like he had gone somewhere inside himself that was far from this cold corner and this broken bus shelter and this stretch of Mercer Street that nobody noticed. Nia slowed her walk without meaning to. She studied him as she approached, the way she studied most things, carefully, without making it obvious. She could see from here that he was hungry, not in the vague, abstract way that she sometimes felt it before dinner, but genuinely, sharply hungry, the kind that had been going on long enough to change how a person sat, how they breathed, how they took up space in the world. She passed him. She walked 4 full steps past the bench, her sneakers quiet on the pavement, her backpack against her shoulders. She felt the weight of her empty lunch pocket. She had eaten the sandwich at noon, and there was nothing left. Her stomach was already beginning to pull with its own quiet need, knowing dinner was still 2 hours away. She took a breath, and she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not moving forward, not turning back, just standing there with her hands in her coat pockets and the wind pulling at the edge of her scarf. Ruth's voice came back to her. "That has to hold you till dinner." And under that, the refrigerator with its near-empty shelves, the bread that was already gone. The calculation her grandmother ran every morning before the sun came all the way up. Nia knew what it was to be hungry. She turned around. She walked back to the bench slowly, stopping a few feet away. The man didn't look up right away. When he did, there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite hope. Hope was too energetic for what she saw. It was more like recognition. The look of someone who had been sitting long enough to stop expecting anything from the world and was now recalibrating. "Hi," Nia said. He nodded just slightly. She reached into her backpack and unzipped the front pocket. She had a small pack of crackers in there, the ones Ruth put in sometimes as extra, the peanut butter kind that came 6 to a pack. She had been saving them for the walk, a habit more than a plan. She pulled them out. She looked at them for a second. Then she reached further back in the main compartment and found the small folded napkin her grandmother had wrapped around the crackers, and underneath it, tucked behind her reading book and the folder with her homework, a piece of paper she had grabbed this morning from the stack near the door. Ruth kept flyers and papers in a pile near the front, bills, community notices, old correspondence, and Nia had grabbed one to use as scratch paper during math. She had never used it. It was still folded in half, blank on one side. Without thinking about it much, she wrapped the crackers in the paper, the way her grandmother always wrapped things, even small things, with a kind of care that made them feel important. And she walked up to the bench and held them out. The man looked at her hand, and then at her face. He didn't move. "It's okay," Nia said. "I already ate." That was mostly true. She had eaten the sandwich. The crackers were extra. He reached out slowly, and she noticed, in the particular way she noticed things, that his hands were not steady. There was a fine tremor in his fingers that wasn't just the cold. He took the wrapped crackers from her carefully, like she was handing him something fragile. He held it for a moment without opening it. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, a little rough, but clear. The voice of a man who hadn't lost the ability to speak so much as the habit of it. "You're welcome," Nia said. She turned to leave. She was 3 steps away when he spoke again. "You didn't just feed me." She stopped, turned halfway. He was looking at her, not in the unfocused way of before, but directly. Why, with an attention that felt too concentrated for a moment like this on a Tuesday afternoon at a broken-down bus stop. "You may have changed something bigger than you know," he said. Nia stood there for a second, not sure what to do with that. It wasn't the kind of thing a kid had a good response to. She gave him a small nod, the polite, uncertain nod of someone who didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to, and then turned and walked the rest of the way home. She didn't look back, but if she had, she would have seen the man slowly unfold the paper wrapping around the crackers, would have seen his hands go still as he looked at what was printed on the other side of the page, the side she hadn't thought about, the side she'd been using as the outside of her wrapping. She would have seen his expression change. The removal, the distance, the exhausted detachment, all of it cracked open at once. He sat very still for a long time, staring at that piece of paper in his hands. And then, for the first time in years, he stood up. Nia woke up the next morning with the feeling that something was different, the way you sometimes wake up knowing a storm is coming, even before you look outside. The light through her curtains was the same pale October gray it always was at 7 in the morning. The radiator clicked and hissed in its usual pattern. From downstairs came the faint smell of coffee. Everything was the same, and yet it wasn't. She got dressed slowly, listening to the sounds of the house the way she always did. Ruth was already up. She could hear her moving in the kitchen, the soft knock of a pot being set on the stove. The radio wasn't on. That was the first small thing. Ruth always had the radio on in the mornings. Nia pulled on her shoes and sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, staring at the floor. The man from yesterday moved through her mind briefly. His shaking hands, that concentrated look, the strange thing he'd said. "You may have changed something bigger than you know." She had turned it over a few times last night before sleep, the way you worry at a loose tooth, not sure what to make of it. In the daylight, it felt like the kind of thing people said sometimes that didn't mean much. A little dramatic, a little strange. She pushed it aside and went downstairs. Ruth was at the stove, but she wasn't really cooking. She was standing with her hand on the handle of the small saucepan and her head tilted slightly, the way she tilted it when she was listening to something. "Grandma?" "Come eat," Ruth said without turning. But there was a tightness in her voice that Nia noticed immediately. Nia sat at the table and ate her toast and watched her grandmother's back. Ruth kept glancing toward the front of the house. Not dramatically, just briefly, quickly, like she was checking on something she didn't want to look at directly. "Is something outside?" Nia asked. "Eat your breakfast." "But—" "Nia." Ruth's voice was quiet, and the quietness of it was more final than volume would have been. Nia ate her toast. She had just taken her last bite when she heard it, or rather started to distinguish it from the background noise of the morning. A rumble of engines, low and steady. Not one car, multiple. The creak and hiss of vehicles stopping in close succession, and under all of it, the crackle of radio static, the kind that came from police radios, a sound every kid who grew up on Mercer Street knew without being taught. Nia pushed back from the table. "Stay here," Ruth said sharply. But she was already moving toward the front door. Ruth caught her arm. "Nia, I said stay here." "What's happening?" Nia's voice was steady, but her heart had picked up speed. Ruth's jaw was tight. Her eyes moved from the front door to her granddaughter's face, and back again, the calculation behind them happening fast. Then she took a short breath and said, "Come with me. Stay behind me." They moved together through the narrow front hallway. Ruth put her hand on the doorknob and paused, a single beat, then opened the door. The porch light was still on from the night before, pale yellow against the morning. The cold air hit them both at once. Nia stepped out from behind her grandmother and stopped. The street in front of their house had been transformed. There were police vehicles, marked cruisers, a few dark department SUVs, 2 vans she didn't recognize, lined up in both directions. They stretched from the intersection at one end of the block, nearly to the hydrant at the other. And between those vehicles and their front porch, spread across the narrow strip of sidewalk and the patchy front yard, were people, uniformed officers. Dozens of them, 50 at least, maybe more. Some standing in formation, some turned slightly, talking quietly to each other. They filled the space in a way that wasn't chaotic. It was ordered, deliberate, organized. Like they had arrived and arranged themselves with purpose. The neighbors had already started emerging. Mrs. Patterson from next door was at her window, her curtain pushed aside. The 2 men who lived in the duplex across the street were on their front steps, one with a coffee mug still in his hand. Down the block, Nia could see more faces, the slow accumulation of people drawn by the sight of too many police vehicles in one place on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday morning. Ruth stepped forward on the porch, drawing herself up to her full height, which wasn't much but carried the kind of authority that had nothing to do with inches. Her hand was still on Nia's arm. "Can I help you?" Ruth said, and her voice didn't waver once. A murmur moved through the nearest officers. Heads turned. A few exchanged glances. Then the crowd parted slightly, and a man walked forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that spoke of decades in uniform. His hair was silver at the sides, his face weathered and deliberate. He wore more rank on his collar than the others around him, and as he approached, he reached up and removed his hat. Nia had seen enough movies and enough of real life to know that police officers removing their hats was not an aggressive gesture. It was not the kind of thing that came before an arrest, but her heart was hammering anyway, because nothing about this scene was anything she had a framework for. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Ruth. Then, slowly, his gaze moved to Nia. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Captain David Mercer. I apologize for the disruption to your morning." His voice was measured, formal, but not cold. "I want you to know, this is not a situation that should alarm you. No one here is in trouble." Ruth's hand tightened on Nia's arm. "Then what is this?" The captain held her gaze. "I'm here because of something that happened yesterday afternoon." He paused. "May I ask, is this your granddaughter?" "She lives here," Ruth said simply. Not a yes, not a no. A statement of territory. The captain nodded, accepting that. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph, which he held out not to Ruth, but slightly between them. An offer, rather than a demand. Ruth stepped down one stair and looked at it without taking it. Nia craned her neck. The photo showed a man, but not the way she had seen him yesterday. In the photo, he was standing straight, in uniform, with a posture that matched the captain's in its deliberateness. He was clean-shaven, his eyes clear and direct. She almost didn't recognize him, but she did. The same jaw, the same shape, to the eyes. The same something that she had noticed and couldn't name, a quality of presence, of attention that didn't disappear even beneath years and hunger and a coat too thin for October. "Yesterday afternoon," Captain Mercer said, his voice very careful now, "near the bus stop on Clement and Fifth." He looked at Nia directly. "Did you give food to a man sitting on that bench?" The street was almost completely quiet. Nia was aware of the watching neighbors, of the officers standing behind the captain in their rows, of her grandmother's hand on her arm, of the cold air on her face. She nodded, just once, just slightly, but definitely. Something moved through the assembled officers, not a sound exactly, but a shift, like something collective, adjusting its balance. Captain Mercer looked at her for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read. It was the face of someone holding several things carefully at once. Then, slowly, his composure cracked just slightly at the edges, and something underneath showed through. Something that looked unexpectedly like relief. "We've been looking for that man," he said. His voice came out a little lower than before. "For a very long time." Ruth made a small sound. Her grip on Nia's arm didn't loosen. "What kind of looking?" Ruth asked, her eyes sharp. "Looking like he did something, because that child didn't know anything about—" "No." The captain shook his head. And for the first time his formal precision softened into something more human. "Not that kind of looking." He glanced at his hat in his hands, then back up. "He was one of us, one of our own. He disappeared 3 years ago, and nobody in this department has stopped looking since." A pause. "Last night, for the first time in 3 years, he walked into a precinct and turned himself in." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of people recalibrating. "What made him come back?" Ruth asked quietly. The captain looked at Nia, not accusatorially, not with confusion, with something that was very close to wonder. "He said a child gave him food," he said, wrapped in a piece of paper he recognized, and something about that. He stopped, searched for the right words. Something about that reached him in a way that 3 years of searches and 3 years of waiting couldn't. The wind moved through the bare branches of the tree at the edge of the yard. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. Nia stood on the porch in her school clothes and her slightly twisted sock, and she looked at the captain and the rows of officers behind him, and she tried to understand what any of this meant. She thought about the man's shaking hands, the way he'd held the wrapped crackers without immediately opening them, the look on his face, that cracked open look she'd noticed just before she turned away. "You may have changed something bigger than you know." She understood it slightly better now, but only slightly. "What happens next?" Ruth asked. The question was pointed. She was still in protective mode. Still reading the situation for danger, still standing between her granddaughter and whatever this was. Captain Mercer put his hat back on. His formality returned, but it was the formality of someone who wanted to be clear about something important. "That," he said, "is what we're still working through. There are things he's brought back with him, things that are going to require time and careful handling." He looked at Nia again, and his voice dropped just slightly, not to a whisper, but to something private in the middle of a public space. "But I want you to know, what you did yesterday mattered. You may not understand why yet. We may not fully understand why yet." He turned, and the lines of officers behind him began the quiet, organized process of returning to their vehicles. There was no ceremony to the departure, just the same deliberate order that had characterized their arrival, reversed. One officer near the back of the group paused as he was walking away and looked back at the porch. He was younger than the others, with a face that was struggling to stay professional. He met Nia's eyes for just a moment. Then he nodded, not as an officer, but as a person, and walked on. The last engine faded at the end of the block. The street was quiet again. The neighbors slowly returned inside. Mrs. Patterson's curtain fell back into place. Nia and Ruth stood on the porch in the cold morning air, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Finally, Ruth let out a long, slow breath. She released Nia's arm. She put her hand on Nia's shoulder instead and pulled her slightly closer. "Come inside," she said. "You're going to be late for school." Nia went inside, but as she picked up her backpack from the hall floor and checked her homework folder and laced up her shoes again, she kept coming back to the captain's last words. Things he's brought back with him, things that are going to require time and careful handling, and under that, still, we've been looking for that man for a very long time. There was a piece of the story she didn't have yet. She could feel the shape of it, the way you could sometimes feel the shape of a room before your eyes adjusted to the dark. Not clearly, not with certainty, but enough to know it was there. She zipped up her backpack and went out the door into the October morning. And somewhere across the city, in a precinct room she had never seen, a man sat across a table from people who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment. And the piece of paper that had been wrapped around a small packet of peanut butter crackers by a 10-year-old girl on Mercer Street sat in the middle of that table, and everyone in the room understood that something had just changed. They just didn't know yet how much. The officers came inside like guests who understood they weren't entirely welcome. Captain Mercer led. 2 others followed, a woman with close-cropped hair and a notepad she kept tucked against her side, and a younger man who stood near the door like he was guarding it from the inside rather than the outside. Ruth watched all 3 of them the way she watched most things that arrived uninvited, with her arms folded, her back straight and her eyes missing nothing. She had made them stand in the front hallway, not the living room. The hallway sent a message, and Ruth Carter was very deliberate about the messages she sent. "I'll give you 10 minutes," she said. "Then this child needs to get to school." Captain Mercer nodded. He reached into the folder the woman beside him was holding and produced a photograph, larger and clearer than the one he'd shown on the porch. He held it out toward Nia with both hands, which she noticed, a deliberate gesture, less like presenting evidence and more like offering something that deserved to be handled carefully. Nia took it. She had already accepted, in the seconds on the porch, that the man in the photo and the man at the bus stop were the same person. But seeing the photo up close made it different, made it real in a way that the distant recognition hadn't been. In the photograph, the man was standing in full dress uniform, his posture straight, his expression carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent years earning the right to look like that. There were medals on his chest. His eyes were focused somewhere just past the camera. "His name is Elijah Grant," Captain Mercer said. "Detective, first grade. He served this department for 19 years. Nia kept looking at the photo. He was decorated 4 times, solved cases that had been sitting cold for a decade. He was the kind of officer— Mercer paused, and something moved behind his composure. He was the kind of officer that made the rest of us want to do better. "What happened to him?" Ruth asked. Her voice was still guarded, but the question had genuine weight behind it. The captain looked at his hat, which he was holding again by the brim. 3 years ago, Elijah was working a case, a serious one. He had gotten further into it than anyone expected, further than some people wanted him to go. He chose his next words carefully. "There was an incident. The specifics are still—" He paused. "Still being worked through. What we know is that after the incident, Elijah disappeared. No note, no contact. His apartment was cleared out, but not in a way that suggested foul play. He was there, and then he wasn't." "And nobody found him in 3 years?" Ruth said. She didn't bother keeping the skepticism out of her voice. "We looked," the woman with the notepad said. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was quiet but direct. "Oh, every quarter, every lead. We never stopped looking." Ruth absorbed this. Her eyes moved to Nia, then back to the captain. "What does any of this have to do with my granddaughter?" Mercer turned to Nia. "Can you tell me, the food you gave him yesterday, how did you wrap it?" Nia thought back. "I had crackers in my bag. I wrapped them in a piece of paper. From my backpack." "Do you know where that paper came from?" She hesitated. "From the pile near our front door. My grandmother keeps papers there. I just grabbed one to wrap things in. I didn't really look at it." The captain and the woman exchanged a glance, not dramatic, just brief, confirming. "That paper," Mercer said slowly, "had a case reference number on it, a department file number from an investigation that was active 3 years ago." "Oh, Elijah's investigation. He let that settle. We don't know yet how it ended up in your home. It may have been a community notice that went out during the search. It may have been something else. But whatever it was, when Elijah saw that number, something came through." Nia looked at the photograph again. She thought about his hands, the way they had gone completely still around the wrapped crackers before he opened them. "He walked into the 3rd precinct at 11:47 last night," the woman said quietly. "First time anyone had seen him in 38 months. Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He didn't say much when he came in," Mercer continued. "He was—" A pause. "He needed medical attention first, food, rest. But when he could talk, the first thing he said was that a child had given him something, and that something about it had reached him." The captain's voice had dropped in a way that was clearly not performed. "He said it made him feel like a person again." The hallway was quiet for a moment. The radiator knocked twice somewhere above them. Nia handed the photograph back carefully, the way it had been offered to her. "There's something else," Mercer said. He was watching Nia when he said it, and she got the sense he was measuring something. Not her, exactly, but her readiness. When Elijah came in, he didn't come empty-handed. He said he had things to tell us, things from the case he was working, things that— Another careful pause. "That are going to take time to properly understand." "What kind of things?" Ruth asked. "The kind," Mercer said, with a precision that was clearly intentional. "That don't belong in a 10-minute hallway conversation." He looked at Ruth directly. "I want to be honest with you. This is the beginning of something, not the end of it. Elijah Grant coming back is significant. What he's brought back with him may be more significant still." Ruth held his gaze for a long moment. Then she unfolded her arms. Just slightly, just enough. "She's going to be late for school," she said. The captain put his hat back on. "Of course." He reached into his jacket and produced a card, which he held out to Ruth rather than Nia. "If anything comes up, or if you have questions." Ruth took it. She didn't look at it. The three officers filed out in the same quiet order they'd arrived. At the door, Mercer turned back once. "Tell her," he said to Ruth with a nod toward Nia, "that what she did wasn't small. Well, I know it might look that way from here, but it wasn't." He left. Ruth closed the door behind him and stood with her hand flat against it for a moment. Nia watched her grandmother's back, the tension in her shoulders, the deliberate evenness of her breathing. Grandma. "Get your bag," Ruth said. "You're already 5 minutes late." Nia got her bag. She was out the door before she let herself think about Elijah Grant, about the version of him in that photograph, standing straight with medals on his chest and 19 years behind his eyes, and the version she had found at a broken bus stop with shaking hands and a coat too thin for October. She thought about Mercer's parting words as she walked. What he's brought back with him may be more significant still. She didn't know what that meant yet. But she was beginning to understand that she was going to find out. 3 days passed before anything else happened. They were strange days, ordinary on the surface and entirely not underneath. School was school. Ruth made meals from what was in the refrigerator and didn't mention Elijah Grant or Captain Mercer or the row of police vehicles that had lined their street like something from a news broadcast. But she watched the front window more than usual, and she had started locking the chain at night, which she hadn't always done before. Nia watched her grandmother watch the window and didn't say anything. She had her own watching to do. On the third morning, there was a story on the local news. Brief, cautious, but framed in the careful language of journalism that knows more than its printing. Something about a former department detective reappearing after a years-long absence and voluntarily cooperating with an ongoing review. No name, no specifics, just enough to confirm that whatever was happening, it had moved beyond the hallway conversation into something larger. Ruth turned the TV off before the segment finished. That afternoon, while Nia was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework open in front of her, Ruth answered the phone and stood for a long time without saying much, just listening, her hand tightening gradually on the receiver. When she hung up, she came to the kitchen table and sat down across from Nia, which was not her usual after-call behavior. "That was someone from the department," Ruth said. "Oh, they want to know if you'd be willing to speak with Detective Grant." Nia looked up from her homework. "Elijah? Don't call him that. That's his name." Ruth pressed her lips together. "He's asked specifically for you, not the department, not the captain, you." She paused. "I want you to understand what I'm about to say. I'm your grandmother. My job, the only job I've had since you were 3 years old, is to keep you safe. And my first instinct here—" She stopped, rebuilt the sentence. "My first instinct is to say no. Nia held her grandmother's gaze. "But," she said. Ruth exhaled slowly. "But I don't want to be the kind of woman who lets fear make decisions for me." She folded her hands on the table. "So I'm asking you, how do you feel about it?" Nia thought about it. Not quickly. No, not in the way of someone who had already decided and was performing consideration, but genuinely the way she thought about most things. She thought about the man at the bus stop, the man in the photograph, the gap between those two versions of the same person and what it meant that one had become the other. "I want to go," she said. Ruth nodded once, like she had expected this answer and had already made her peace with it. "I'm coming with you," she said. "That's not negotiable." "I know," Nia said. They met Elijah Grant at a community center 3 neighborhoods over, neutral ground, by design. Captain Mercer had arranged it. There were no uniforms visible, which Nia noticed right away, and she understood that this, too, was intentional. He was sitting at a round table near the window when they came in, and he looked better than he had at the bus stop, cleaner, steadier, a little more present in his own body. Someone had given him a proper coat. His beard was still there, but trimmed now, and his hands, when he set them on the table as they approached, were still. He stood when he saw them. It was a small, old-fashioned gesture, and Ruth noticed it. Nia could tell from the slight shift in her grandmother's posture. "Mrs. Carter," he said to Ruth, with a formality that recognized her authority in this situation. Then he looked at Nia. "You." "Me," Nia agreed. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face and disappeared. He sat back down. They took the chairs across from him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were direct but careful, the eyes of someone choosing words with real precision. "I want to say something first," he said, "before anything else. What you did the other day, it wasn't just an act of kindness. For me, it was—" He stopped. "I had gotten to a place where I had stopped believing that anything could reach me. I had convinced myself over 3 years that I was too far gone to come back." A pause. "That paper changed that. But it wasn't just the paper. It was the way you wrapped it, like it was worth wrapping." Ruth was very still across the table. Nia didn't quite know what to do with that, so she just nodded. Elijah Grant turned his cup of water in a slow circle on the table. "I need to tell you both something, and I need you to understand that I'm not telling you this to frighten you." He looked at Ruth. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're connected to." "Then tell us," Ruth said. "I didn't disappear because I broke down," he said. "I disappeared because I found something I wasn't supposed to find." He paused, letting that land. "I was working a financial crimes case, on the surface a city contracting fraud. Small scale, or so it seemed, but the further I got into it, the bigger it became. Money being moved through accounts that didn't exist, evidence that had been altered in old cases, files that had been sealed without proper authority." His voice was measured, unhurried. "And then I found names attached to it, people inside the department, not low-level people." Ruth's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "You're saying there's corruption." "I'm saying there was corruption," Elijah said carefully. "Oh, whether it's still active, how much of it remains, that's what I've been bringing to the right people since I came back in." He looked at Nia. "But here's the thing that involves you specifically." Nia straightened slightly. "Before I went underground, I hid evidence, physical documents, recorded files, other materials, things I couldn't trust to stay safe inside the department. I distributed them, kept them in separate locations, and I created a reference system to find them." He paused. "That system used case numbers as location keys. The number on the paper you used to wrap my food, it was one of those keys." The room felt very quiet. "That paper told me," Elijah said, "exactly where one of those caches is. And it told me something else, that somehow the paper had survived and had been sitting in a civilian home, completely unknown to anyone looking for it. His expression was hard to read. That's not coincidence. I don't know what it is yet, but it's not coincidence. Ruth opened her mouth. I know what you're going to say, Elijah said gently. And you're right to say it. Your granddaughter is 10 years old. This is not something she should be part of. Then why are we here? Ruth said. Because she already is part of it, he said. Not by her choice and not by yours. But the people who don't want this evidence found, they know I've come back. They know something triggered it. It won't take them long to trace back. Ruth stood up. No, she said. The word was flat and final, and the most decisive sound Nia had ever heard her grandmother make. Whatever this is, whatever you found, whatever these people are, that is not her problem. She gave you a handful of crackers, that's all. Grandma! Don't! Ruth's voice was not raised, but it had a quality that stopped Nia completely. She looked at Elijah. She is 10 years old. Elijah didn't flinch. He held Ruth's gaze steadily and without defensiveness. I know, he said, and I'm not asking anything of her. I'm asking you to be careful, both of you. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a small card on the table. Not a department card, just a number written in plain ink. If anything feels wrong, if anyone approaches you, if anything changes around your house. He slid it to Ruth's side of the table. That number reaches me directly, not the department, me. Ruth looked at the card for a long moment. Then she picked it up and put it in her coat pocket. We're leaving, she said. Nia got up. When she was nearly at the door when Elijah spoke again. Nia. She turned. He looked at her with that concentrated attention she remembered from the bus stop, the look of someone seeing something clearly. What you did saved me, he said. I need you to understand that the way I understand it. A pause. But now, because of what I've just told you, there may be people who see you as a connection to something they want to stay buried. His voice was very steady. I'm working as fast as I can to make sure that doesn't become your problem, but I needed you to hear this from me, not from someone else, not later. Nia held his gaze. Okay, she said. It wasn't a big word. It didn't try to carry more than it could hold. But she said it the way her grandmother said things, with the understanding that acknowledging a truth and accepting it were different from being defeated by it. She followed Ruth out into the afternoon. They walked to the bus stop 2 blocks from the community center in silence. When the bus came and they got on and sat down, Ruth reached over without looking at her and took Nia's hand. That was all. They rode home that way. Ruth's hand around Nia's, the city moving past the windows, the small card with Elijah's number sitting in Ruth's coat pocket like a weight that had just arrived and would not be leaving any time soon. And as they turned onto the block that led to Mercer Street, their worn and tired and familiar street, Nia looked out the window and noticed something she might not have noticed 3 days ago. A dark car parked across from their house, engine off, no one visible through the tinted windows. It had been there before, maybe. She couldn't be sure. It was the kind of car that didn't stand out, the kind you weren't meant to notice. She watched it as the bus moved past, and as it slid out of view behind them, she became very certain, with the same bone-level certainty that had made her turn back at the bus stop 3 days ago, that whoever was in that car, they had been watching for her. The car came back the next morning. Nia saw it from her bedroom window before she came downstairs. The same dark sedan, same position across the street, engine off, windows catching the early light in a way that made it impossible to see inside. It had been there when she went to bed. It was there when she woke up. She stood at the window in her pajamas for almost a full minute, watching it the way it was watching her house, and then she got dressed and went downstairs without saying anything about it. Ruth had already seen it. Nia could tell from the way her grandmother moved through the kitchen that morning, efficiently, quietly, with none of the usual rhythm of someone going through familiar motions. Ruth was paying attention to things outside the kitchen while pretending to pay attention to things inside it. They ate breakfast without discussing the car. They ate dinner that evening without discussing it either. But when Nia woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the sound of the front door, a single deliberate knock, she heard Ruth's footsteps cross the hallway and stop. A long pause, the sound of the chain being checked, then silence. She crept to the top of the stairs. "Grandma?" Ruth was standing at the base of the stairs looking up at her. In the dim light from the front window, her face was composed, deliberately so, in the way of someone managing something they haven't yet decided how to name. "Go back to bed," Ruth said. "Who knocked?" Ruth hesitated for exactly 1 second, the first time Nia could remember her grandmother hesitating before answering a direct question. "Nobody," she said. "Go to sleep." Nia went back to her room. She did not go to sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, and listened to the house settle around her. And after a while she heard Ruth come up the stairs and go back to her room, and after another while the neighborhood went fully quiet in the particular way it went quiet at 3 in the morning, which was not silence so much as the absence of the ordinary. In the morning there was a note on the front mat. Ruth found it when she went to bring in the milk. She stood at the door for a moment reading it, and then she folded it once and put it in her housecoat pocket and closed the door and did not say anything about it until Nia came down and asked directly. Ruth unfolded the note and set it on the kitchen table without a word. It was a small piece of paper, torn at one edge, the message written in plain block letters with no decoration. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." Nia read it twice. She felt something move through her that was not quite fear. Fear was too simple a word for it. It was more like the physical awareness of having crossed a line she hadn't seen and couldn't uncross. She had been involved before this note, but the note made it different. The note meant that someone had been outside their door in the dark and had chosen to do this rather than something else, and the choice itself was a message inside the message. She folded the note along Ruth's crease and slid it back across the table. "We should call Elijah," she said. "I already did," Ruth said quietly, "while you were upstairs." She set a cup of tea on the table and sat down across from Nia, and for a moment she just looked at her granddaughter, that long, measuring look that Nia had seen her whole life and never been able to fully read. It was the look of someone weighing something that didn't have clean sides. "He's calling back," Ruth said. "We wait." The call came 40 minutes later. When Nia sat at the table while Ruth stood at the window with the phone, and even from across the room she could hear the change in Elijah's voice through the receiver, not louder but tighter, sharper. He spoke quickly, and Ruth listened without interrupting, and when she finally said something, it was only, "Understood." She hung up. She turned to Nia. "He says they've started moving faster than he expected," Ruth said. She paused. "He says we shouldn't go anywhere alone, and he says—" She stopped, looked at the folded note on the table, then looked at her granddaughter with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to remain neutral. "He wants to talk to you." "I know," Nia said. "I told him no." "I know that too." Ruth sat back down. She wrapped her hands around her own cup and stared at the table. Outside, a car passed slowly, not the dark sedan, just a neighbor leaving early. But they both tracked the sound without acknowledging they were doing it, and that tracking, that involuntary shared attention to something that should have been ordinary, told Nia more than anything either of them could have said. "Grandma," she said. Ruth looked up. "I know you want to keep me out of this," Nia said. "I know that's your job, and I know you've been doing it my whole life. She kept her voice steady, careful, choosing words the way Elijah chose words, with an awareness of what they were carrying. But whatever this is, I started it. Not because I meant to, not because I knew what I was doing, but I did it. She paused. If I can help finish it, I think I should be allowed to try. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Ruth pressed her lips together, looked away, looked back. "You sound like you're 40 years old," she said finally. "I'm trying to sound like you," Nia said. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not resolved, not surrendered, but shifted. The hard line was still there, but it had moved. "What does he want?" she said. Elijah came to the house that afternoon through the back, through Mrs. Patterson's yard, by arrangement. He looked the way he'd looked at the community center, stable and deliberate. But there was a focused energy in how he moved now that hadn't been there before. Things had changed in the days since they'd met, and the change was written on him. Ruth let him in through the kitchen door and sat him down and put coffee in front of him without being asked, which Nia understood was not warmth exactly, but was a kind of practical acknowledgement, a setting of terms. "You are here. This is how we do things in this house." Elijah looked at the folded note on the table. His jaw tightened for just a moment. "Before I say anything else," he said, looking at Ruth, "I want to be clear that I would not be here if I thought there was another way. I've been trying to build a case that doesn't involve either of you at all. I'm still trying." "But," Ruth said, "but the evidence I need, the core of it, the piece that makes everything else hold, is in a location that I can't get to without being followed. I've tried twice in the last 4 days. Both times a vehicle came within a block of where I was going." He exhaled. "They're watching me. They have been since I came back in." He reached into his jacket and unfolded a piece of paper, a hand-drawn map, simple and rough, just shapes and numbers. He laid it on the table facing Nia. "There's an old building off Clement," he said. "Used to be a records annex. The city decommissioned it years ago. It's been sitting empty. Nobody goes there." He tapped a square on the map. "Inside, behind the second interior wall, on the north side, there are panels that come loose. Behind the third panel from the left, there's a metal box." He looked at Nia. "Documents, photographs, 2 recorded drives. Everything that was gathered before I went underground." A pause. "Everything that proves what happened and who made it happen." Ruth was already straightening in her chair. "She is not going alone to an abandoned building," she said. "Not alone," Elijah said quickly. "I'll be nearby. Not inside, not on the street, but close. If anything changes, I can be there in under a minute." He looked at Ruth with a directness that didn't flinch. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs you to hear it. But the reason I need her specifically is because she won't be followed. She's a child walking home from school. Nobody looking for me is watching a 10-year-old. "That's exactly what they said about her before they put that note on my door," Ruth said. Elijah went quiet. "They don't know what she means to the case yet," he said carefully. "They know she's connected to me. They don't know how. That window is small, and it's closing." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then Nia said, "Tell me exactly what to do." Ruth's head turned sharply. "If I'm going," Nia said, looking at her grandmother, "I want to know everything, every step, every detail." She looked at Elijah. "And she comes with me to the street outside. She doesn't wait here alone." Elijah looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Nia. And in that triangle of looks, something passed between all 3 of them, an agreement that wasn't comfortable or clean, but was honest, which was the only kind of agreement any of them would have accepted. "Every step," Elijah confirmed. "Starting now." They went the next morning. Ruth had barely slept. Nia had slept better than she expected, The deep, practical sleep of someone who has made a decision and found the question marks on the other side of it temporarily quiet. She was up before her alarm, dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans, her blue jacket, hot sneakers, the kind of thing a kid wore on any given weekday when she had nowhere particular to be. Because that was the point, she was just a kid, going nowhere particular. The dark sedan was not on their street when she looked out the window at 6:15. That was either good or it wasn't. She had learned in the past week that the absence of visible threat was not the same as the absence of threat. But she took a breath and went downstairs, and Ruth was already at the kitchen door with her coat on, her face set in the expression of someone who had made their peace with something they hadn't chosen. Elijah had been specific. Take the long route, not the direct one. Walk at ordinary speed. Don't look around more than a kid normally would. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, turn around and go home. He would be in a position to see her for most of the route. He would not be visible. Nia had memorized the map. She had looked at it so many times the night before that she could have drawn it herself from memory. Left at the dry cleaner, right at the church, past the lot with the chain-link fence, down the alley that ran alongside the old records building, around to the side entrance. The door would be unlocked. Elijah had arranged it through a contact he trusted. She would have 10 minutes, maybe 12. She stepped outside into the cold. The morning felt different from other mornings, the way all things felt different now that she had stopped being someone the world moved past without noticing. The air was colder than yesterday, the sky overcast. The street quiet in the mid-morning way it got after the early commuters had gone and before the rest of the day picked up. Ruth walked beside her to the end of Mercer Street. At the corner, she stopped. Nia stopped too. Ruth looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then she reached out and adjusted the collar of Nia's jacket, a small, precise gesture that had nothing to do with the collar and everything to do with the fact that this was the last thing a mother figure could do before letting go. 10 minutes, Ruth said. 10 minutes, Nia agreed. She turned and walked. She did not look back. The streets were familiar, and they were not. She had walked all of these blocks before. This was her neighborhood, her morning air, her cracked pavement, but the familiarity felt thin now, like a coat that didn't quite fit over what was underneath. She tracked her own footsteps without appearing to. She counted cross streets. She kept her pace ordinary. She turned left at the dry cleaner. A man was walking ahead of her, a bag over his shoulder, moving fast. She tracked him until he turned off at the next intersection. A woman pushed a stroller in the other direction, talking on her phone, not looking at anything around her. A dog barked once from behind a chain-link fence and went quiet, right at the church. The building came into view from the end of the block. It was exactly as Elijah had described. A flat, square structure, city gray, with boarded windows on the upper floor and a chain on the front door that had been there long enough to go orange with rust. It looked forgotten in a very complete way, the way buildings looked when people had stopped walking past them. There was no reason for anyone to look at it. She went around the side. The side entrance was a metal door, slightly ajar, its frame gone soft with age. She pushed it open just enough to slip through. Inside, the building was cold and dim, the only light coming from narrow gaps in the boards over the windows, pale, slanted bars across the floor. The smell was dust and old paper and something metallic underneath. The space was mostly empty, the floor concrete, the walls bare except for old mounting brackets where shelving had been removed. She found the north wall the way Elijah had told her. The longer wall, the one with the old ventilation grate at the top. The panels were prefabricated sections of drywall, several of them slightly warped along the bottom where moisture had gotten in over the years. She ran her hand along the third from the left until she felt the edge give. Just slightly, just enough. She pressed, and the panel swung inward on a concealed hinge. Behind it was a space about the size of a large cabinet, dark and dry. And on the floor of that space, a metal box, rectangular, the kind of thing that could be a toolbox or a document case, depending on who was using it. It had a simple latch, not a lock. She crouched and opened it. Inside was exactly what Elijah had described. A sheaf of documents in a rubber-banded stack. Reports, printouts, handwritten notes in neat small script. Photographs, a dozen or more, some showing documents and some showing people in places they clearly hadn't known they were being observed. And 2 small recording drives, the older kind, taped together with a strip of masking tape that had a date written on it in the same neat hand. Nia looked at it all for a moment. She didn't fully understand what she was looking at. The language of the reports was administrative and full of terms she didn't know, but she understood enough. She understood the photographs. She understood the signatures at the bottom of documents that had been altered, the handwritten notes that cross-referenced names to transactions, the dates that formed a pattern even to someone who didn't know what pattern they were looking for. This was real. Whatever else was true, however large or complicated or dangerous this had become, this was real, and it had been real for a long time, and someone had kept it hidden here for 3 years, waiting for a moment when it could mean something. She picked up the box. It was heavier than she expected. She held it against her chest with both arms and turned toward the door. And stopped. Someone was standing in the doorway, not the side door she had come in through. The interior door, the one that connected this room to the rest of the building, which she had assumed was empty. An officer, uniformed, badge visible, one hand resting at his side with a deliberateness that was not casual. She recognized him. Not his name. She had never known his name, but his face. He had been one of the officers on her street that first morning. His standing 2 rows back, the kind of face you filed away without realizing you were doing it. He looked at the box in her arms, then at her face. "You should have stayed out of this," he said. His voice was cold in a way that the morning outside hadn't been. It was the cold of something that had been waiting to say exactly this. Nia didn't speak. Every part of her was paying attention to the room, to the door behind her, to the weight of the box against her chest, to the gap between where she stood and where he stood. 10 feet, maybe 12. "Put the box down," he said. She did not put the box down. He took a step forward, and then something happened very fast. The side door behind her burst open, not violently, not with the force of someone breaking in, but with the controlled speed of someone who had been close and had been listening and had heard exactly the right trigger. Elijah came through the door with the particular movement of someone who had once been very good at this kind of thing and had not entirely forgotten how. He put himself between Nia and the officer in a single motion that used the space efficiently and left very little room for interpretation. "Back up," he said. The officer's expression shifted from cold control to something more complicated. He had clearly not expected Elijah to be here. His eyes moved to the box in Nia's arms, then back to Elijah. The calculation behind his face was visible. "Grant," he said, "think about what you're doing." "I've thought about it for 3 years," Elijah said. "Get out." Something moved in the officer's expression, a flicker of the thing underneath the cold, something that looked almost like fear dressed in the wrong clothes. He stood there for a moment longer than made sense, and then he turned and walked back through the interior door. His footsteps crossed the building and faded. Nia stood completely still with the box held against her chest, her heart loud in her ears, the cold air of the building pressing around her. Elijah turned. He looked at her the way she had first looked at him, carefully, completely, as if cataloging whether she was intact. "You okay?" She nodded once. He looked at the box. "You found it." "It's all in here," she said. He exhaled, a single slow breath that carried 3 years of something with it. He reached out and took the box from her arms. and the relief in his hands when he held it was something Nia would not forget. It was the same kind of relief that had been in his hands when he first took those crackers from her at the bus stop. The relief of a person receiving something they had almost stopped believing was coming. "We need to move," he said. They went out the side door into the gray morning. Nia blinked in the light and fell into step beside him, and they moved quickly, but not at a run, down the alley and back toward the street where Ruth was waiting at the corner of Mercer with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the end of the block. She saw them coming, and she let out a breath that her whole body had been holding. When they reached her, she put her hand on Nia's face the same way she had done at the kitchen table that first morning, palm against cheek, brief and certain. "Inside," she said. They went inside. Elijah set the box on the kitchen table and stood back from it, and the three of them looked at it sitting there under the kitchen light. This metal rectangle full of documents and photographs and drives that had been hidden in a cold room behind a false wall for 3 years, and the weight of what it represented settled into the room without ceremony. "He'll report back," Elijah said quietly. "The officer in there, he's not going to sit on this. They'll know I have it now." Ruth looked at the box, then at Elijah. "What do we do?" Elijah's jaw was set. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who had arrived at a decision that had been forming for a long time. "We can't handle this quietly anymore," he said. We can't trust the department to process this internally, not while there are still people inside who want it buried." He looked at Ruth, then at Nia. "I know someone outside the system, a journalist. She's been trying to get at stories like this for years. She's careful, she's credible, and she doesn't answer to anyone who would want this to disappear." "That's a big step," Ruth said. "There isn't a small one left," Elijah said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The radiator knocked. Outside, somewhere down the block, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood continued. A car engine, a door, someone calling to someone else across a yard. Nia looked at the box on the table. She thought about the note on the front mat. The dark car across the street. At the officer in the doorway of the records building with his hand at his side and 3 years of someone else's secret in his eyes. She thought about the man at the bus stop, the shaking hands, the careful way he had received something small as though it were extraordinary. She looked at Elijah. "Then we take it to her," Nia said. Elijah looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. And outside, barely audible through the kitchen window, the sound of a car engine idled slowly past the house and did not stop and kept going. But they all heard it, and they all knew it wouldn't be the last time. The journalist's name was Carol Weston. Elijah had described her the night before as someone who had spent 15 years covering city politics and local government, and had developed the particular quality of stillness that came from years of sitting across from people who were trying to manage what she knew. She was careful, he said. She was not reckless, not theatrical, not interested in the story for its own sake. She was interested in it because it was true, and truth, in her experience, was something that had a right to exist in the open. They met her at a diner 4 neighborhoods from Mercer Street on a Tuesday morning when the place was half empty and the tables near the back were occupied by nobody. Ruth had insisted on a public space. Elijah had agreed without argument. Carol Weston was already there when they arrived, a cup of coffee at her elbow. A notebook closed on the table in front of her, her eyes moving to the door with the attentiveness of someone who had been waiting without being impatient. She was a white woman in her mid-40s, gray coming in at her temples, dressed in the practical way of someone who spent a lot of time moving between places. She stood when they approached and extended her hand to Ruth first, which Nia noticed. "Thank you for coming," Carol said. "We'll see," Ruth said plainly. She sat down. Carol looked at Nia briefly, not with the assessing look of someone calculating how to use her, but with the look of someone who was adjusting what they had expected. Then she looked at Elijah, and in that look was something longer. Recognition, weight, the acknowledgement of something that preceded this table, and this diner, and this morning. "Elijah," she said. "Carol," he said. He sat down. Elijah set the metal box on the table. Carol looked at it without touching it. The morning light coming through the diner window fell across it in a flat, ordinary way, which felt wrong for what it contained. "Tell me everything," Carol said. She opened her notebook. It took most of the morning. Elijah talked, and Carol listened, and occasionally she asked a question. Brief, precise, the kind of question that opened a door rather than closing one. She did not interrupt. She did not express surprise at the parts that were surprising, which Nia noted and respected. She just wrote and listened and wrote more, and when the story had been fully laid out across the table between them, she looked at the box and said, "Can I?" Elijah nodded. She opened it carefully, he with the same deliberateness that Nia had used in the building, lifting the documents by their edges, looking at photographs without altering their arrangement, turning the 2 recording drives over in her hands, and setting them aside. She read for a long time. Nobody spoke. When she finally set the last document down and looked up, her expression had changed. Not dramatically. But the attentiveness had deepened into something else, something that was partly the professional assessment of a journalist who had just confirmed the scope of a major story, and partly the more human response of someone who had been told that a thing was true and had just seen the proof. "How many names?" Ruth asked quietly from across the table. "Enough," Carol said. She looked at Elijah. "This goes beyond the precinct." "I know," he said. "There are people in this who have," she stopped, recalibrated. "People who have been making decisions about this city for a long time. People who have been trusted." "I know," he said again. Carol closed her notebook. She looked at the box, then at the 3 of them in turn. "I want you to understand what happens when I publish this. It won't be quiet. There will be a period between the story breaking and the investigations catching up that will be loud and complicated, and during which people who are named in this material will try every available avenue to discredit it." She looked at Elijah specifically. "And you." "Let them try," Elijah said. "I'm not saying that lightly. They will come at your history, your disappearance, your mental state. They will try to make the story about you rather than about what you found." She held his gaze. "Are you ready for that?" A pause. Something moved through Elijah's expression. Not doubt, but the honest confrontation of a person who knows the cost of something and is paying it anyway. 38 months, he said, on the streets, watching this city keep moving like nothing happened. He looked at the box. "Yes, I'm ready." Carol looked at Ruth. "And you understand that your family may also be, that Nia's name may come out in some form." Ruth's hands tightened on her coffee cup. "She's a child. I know. I will protect her identity in every way the law allows and several ways it doesn't require." Carol's voice was quiet and direct. But I can't promise the world will be equally careful once the story is out there." Ruth sat with that for a moment. The diner hummed around them, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of the other tables, the ordinary sounds of a morning that didn't know what was sitting in the back corner. "What I can tell you," Carol said more gently, "is that the alternative, leaving this in a box, letting those people continue operating as if none of this happened, that has a cost too, a different kind, one that falls on people who never get to sit at a table and decide whether to pay it." Ruth looked at Nia. Nia looked back at her grandmother. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. 3 weeks ago, She had stood at a broken bus stop and turned back because she couldn't keep walking past someone who was hungry and ashamed and trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. She had been 10 years old, she had had one decision available to her, and she had made it without knowing what it would become. This was the same decision, larger. Ruth turned back to Carol. "Publish it," she said. Carol Weston published her story 4 days later. It ran first online in the early hours of a Thursday morning, and by the time the print edition hit the stands, it had already been shared tens of thousands of times and picked up by 3 major outlets and cited in a statement from the city council member who represented the district where the records annex was located. The headline was straightforward: "Former detective surfaces with evidence of years-long department corruption." Senior officials named. Nia read it on Ruth's phone at the kitchen table before school. Carol had been precise about Nia's role. She was described only as a child from the neighborhood whose act of kindness had, indirectly, set events in motion. No name, no address, no school, just a 10-year-old girl. It was both less than the full truth and more protective than Nia had been prepared to hope for, and she sat with the phone in her hands for a moment after reading it and felt something complicated. Not quite pride, because this hadn't been about pride, and not quite relief, because things were only beginning, but something adjacent to both. Something that felt like standing on solid ground after a long time on uncertain terrain. By the time she got to school that morning, Mrs. Holloway had the news open on her laptop at her desk. By lunchtime, Marcus from the back row was talking loudly to anyone who would listen about how his uncle knew someone in the 3rd Precinct and had heard something. By the end of the day, the story had reached the kind of density in public conversation where you couldn't turn on a screen or step into a conversation without it being present. And on Mercer Street, something was changing too. The dark sedan was gone. It had not returned since the morning after the records building, and its absence, which had felt suspicious when it began, a calm before something, now felt different. Final, maybe, or at least suspended. One Patterson knocked on Ruth's door that evening with a covered dish and the particular expression of a neighbor who has been watching from the window long enough to form a view and has finally decided to bring it to the front door. "I don't know what happened," she said to Ruth, with her eyes briefly on Nia. "But I know it was something, and I know it was brave." Ruth accepted the dish. "Come in," she said. The days that followed were not clean. Elijah had been right about what Carol had warned about. The story broke, and immediately the noise began. Official statements from the department calling the evidence unverified, pieces appearing in smaller outlets, quoting unnamed sources, suggesting Elijah's mental state was compromised after his disappearance, questions raised about chain of custody, about motivations, about why a man would disappear for 3 years and then suddenly return with documents and recordings, and a very convenient story. The machinery of institutional self-protection was loud and well-resourced and had been doing this specific job for a long time. But the evidence was louder. Because Carol Weston had not published on instinct or speed, she had spent those 4 days between the diner and the story verifying. Cross-referencing. Having the recording drives analyzed by an independent forensic firm. Confirming signatures and dates with sources who had nothing to do with Elijah and nothing to gain from protecting him. By the time the official statements came out calling it unverified, it had already been verified by methods that were difficult to argue with. 3 days after publication, the first arrest was made, then another. Then 2 in 1 day, which the news covered with the barely contained energy of something people had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. Nia watched some of this on the evening news with her grandmother, and some of it she heard secondhand at school, and some of it she missed entirely because life was still life and school was still school, and Ruth still made sure she ate and slept and did her homework regardless of what was happening in precincts and courtrooms across the city. Nia was grateful for that. The normalcy was not denial. It was something more deliberate. Ruth Carter had raised her granddaughter to understand that the world could be large and complicated and sometimes dangerous and still require you to finish your homework. These facts were not in contradiction, but not everything that followed was manageable. One evening, 10 days after publication, a car slowed in front of their house. Not the dark sedan, a different one, and someone took a photograph. Just one from a moving vehicle, nothing dramatic. But Nia saw it from the upstairs window and felt something tighten in her chest that didn't fully loosen for the rest of the night. She didn't tell Ruth about the photograph, but she was quieter than usual at dinner, and Ruth noticed, the way Ruth noticed everything, and reached across the table and put her hand on Nia's briefly, without asking questions. There was a night when someone called the house at midnight and didn't speak, and hung up after 15 seconds of silence. Ruth stood in the hallway with the receiver in her hand and Nia at the top of the stairs, and they looked at each other across the dark of the house, and neither of them pretended it was nothing. Ruth called Elijah's number. He answered on the second ring, as he always did now, and said he would have someone check the block. These things were real. Nia didn't minimize them to herself or pretend they weren't frightening. Being brave, she had learned, did not mean not being scared. It meant being scared and moving forward anyway, which was a different thing entirely and considerably harder. Through all of it, Elijah called every other evening, not to report progress, though he did that too, but just to check. It was a small thing. Nia understood, in the way she understood most things, that it cost him something. That the checking in was its own kind of evidence, a different kind from the metal box, about what 3 years alone on the streets had meant, and what having people to call now meant in contrast. One evening he called, and she was the one who answered, and he asked how she was holding up, and she told him honestly that it was hard sometimes, that school felt strange when she knew what she knew, that she missed the version of things before any of this started. And he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Me too." And then, "But I wouldn't go back, would you?" She thought about it, about the bus stop, the crackers, the shaking hands. "No," she said. She heard him exhale. "Good," he said. 4 months passed. Not quickly. Months with that much in them don't pass quickly. But they passed. The investigations continued and deepened and pulled in people who had seemed, from the outside, like fixtures of the city's institutional landscape, people whose names appeared on buildings and letterheads and whose photographs had been taken at charity dinners for years. Some of them hired lawyers who issued statements. Some hired different lawyers when the first ones ran out of things to say. The recordings from the 2 drives, the ones on the masking tape-bound pair Nia had found in the metal box, turned out to be the kind of evidence that was very difficult to issue a statement around because they contained voices, and voices were specific in ways that documents could be argued around. Elijah had been right about all of it. That was the quiet constant through the 4 months, the way events confirmed, piece by piece. The account he had been carrying alone for 3 years on streets that didn't know his name. He was formally reinstated 8 weeks after publication. The ceremony was private, held in a conference room at the 3rd Precinct, attended by Captain Mercer and a handful of others who had spent 3 years not giving up. Elijah told Nia about it afterward on the phone, in the same matter-of-fact way he told her most things. She asked how it felt. "Like putting a coat on," he said after a pause, "one you forgot you owned, and it still fits." She told Ruth. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good." The single word carried everything she meant, which was considerable. On Mercer Street, the changes were smaller and steadier than what was happening in courtrooms. The dark sedan never came back. Mrs. Patterson had taken to leaving small things on their porch, a plant once, and another time a jar of something she'd made, with a handwritten label in her careful cursive. The man at the end of the block who had watched from his front steps the morning the officers came now waved when he saw Nia, the easy wave of someone acknowledging something they couldn't quite name but recognized. Nia went back to being a student at Hargrove Elementary mostly. She sat by the window. She finished her work before the rest of the class. She watched Marcus give Tyler the second sandwich and didn't say anything about it. The sameness of things was comforting in the way that only sameness could be after a season of nothing being the same. One afternoon, about 3 months in, Ms. Holloway kept her behind after class. Not for anything wrong, just to say, "Look carefully. I want you to know that I see you, whatever you've been going through. I see you." And Nia thanked her and meant it, and walked home thinking about how much it mattered, being seen, how much it had always mattered, and how she had spent most of her life being the kind of person other people didn't quite see, and how strange and humbling and complicated it was that the act which had changed, that was one she hadn't planned or calculated or done for any reason except that she couldn't keep walking. The ceremony was held on a Saturday in late February, when the cold had begun its slow retreat from the city, and the morning light had that particular quality of winter, releasing its hold, tentative and clear. It wasn't a formal city event. No ribbon cutting, no podium, no officials in suits performing visibility. Captain Mercer had asked, through Ruth, whether they could come to the house. Not to the precinct, not to a community center or a hall with folding chairs and a sound system, to the house on Mercer Street. And Ruth had stood at the kitchen window for a moment with the phone against her ear, and then she had said yes. Nia didn't know how many to expect. Ruth had said simply, "Some officers come presentable." She came downstairs that Saturday morning in the one dress she owned that was appropriate for occasions, with her hair done the way Ruth had taught her, and found her grandmother standing at the front window with her coffee cup and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this morning for a long time. "They're here," Ruth said. Nia looked out. The street in front of their house had filled again. Officers, uniformed, standing in quiet rows, the same spread that had covered the block 4 months ago on an October morning when she had opened the door not knowing what she was opening it to. Marked cruisers at either end. The same geography, the same lines, the same October cold now turned to February cold. But this time there were no radios crackling, no neighbors peering through curtains in alarm. This time Mrs. Patterson was standing on her own porch, watching, and the man from the end of the block was there on the sidewalk, and a few others Nia recognized from windows and porches, and front steps had come out into the morning too. Not because something alarming had happened, but because something worth witnessing had. Ruth opened the door. But the sight of it hit Nia differently than that first morning, not with fear, but with something heavier and harder to name. She stood on the porch in her dress and her good shoes and looked out at the rows of officers who had arranged themselves in front of a worn-down house on Mercer Street on a Saturday in February. And she thought about what had brought all of them here and how far back the line of cause ran. Back past the metal box and the records building and the diner and the hallway conversation and the photograph that Mercer had shown her. Back past all of it to a cold October afternoon and a man at a bus stop and a decision she hadn't known she was making until she had already made it. Captain Mercer came forward, no hat removal this time. This time it was already off, held at his side from the moment he stepped forward. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "We came," he said, "because we wanted to, not because it's required and not because it's protocol, because some things need to be witnessed." He looked at Ruth, then at Nia. This department has had a hard 4 months. Not because the truth came out, the truth needed to come out, but hard because of what it means to find out how far wrong things had gone, and for how long, and under whose watch. His voice was steady and unhurried. And in the middle of all of it, we kept coming back to this, to the beginning of it, to a 10-year-old girl who had every reason to keep walking. Something moved through the watching officers. Not a sound exactly, a kind of collective stilling. "We're not here to give you an award," Mercer said to Nia. We're not here to make a speech or take a photo or tell you what you should be proud of. We're here because the people standing behind me asked to be here, because they wanted to stand in front of your house the right way for the right reason and be seen doing it." He looked at her. "That's all." Elijah stepped forward from the second row. He was in his uniform, the full dress, the same one he wore in the photograph Mercer had shown her 4 months ago. But there was something different about it now, or maybe something different about the person inside it. The distance was gone. The terrible, quiet removal she had seen at the bus stop and in traces at the community center. He stood in his uniform like someone who had earned the right to wear it twice, once in the years before and once in what it had cost him to come back. And he walked up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. He reached into his jacket. He produced something small and held it out in his palm, a shield, a badge, smaller than a department issue, not the kind a working officer carried, but the commemorative kind, the kind given at retirement ceremonies and commissioning events. It had been polished so recently it still held a streak of reflected light across its face. Nia looked at it. "It was mine," Elijah said, "from my first year. I kept it because—" He paused. "Because I thought someday it might mean something to give it to someone who had earned it more than I had." He looked at her steadily with those direct eyes that had first focused on her across a cold sidewalk and had not really looked away since. "I've been wrong about a lot of things." "I'm not wrong about this." Nia took the badge. It was lighter than she expected. She turned it in her hands and looked at its worn face. The raised lettering, the small imperfections of something carried for years. "You didn't just give me a sandwich," Elijah said. "You didn't just start something, you gave me a reason to come back." His voice was very quiet now, just for the porch, just for the 4 of them, Nia and Ruth and Mercer and Elijah and the February morning around them. I had been sitting on that bench telling myself that nothing I did could matter anymore, that I was too far gone, that the truth I was carrying was too heavy for one person, and that the world had gotten along fine without it. A pause. "You walked back, that's all you did. You walked back." He exhaled. I've been trying to do the same thing ever since." Nia held the badge and stood very still and let the morning be what it was. Behind her, she heard Ruth make a sound that was not quite crying, and not quite not crying either. A sound that came from the place where pride and grief and love existed together, without any clean separation between them. The rows of officers on the street were quiet. The neighbors watching from the sidewalk were quiet. Even the city, for that one suspended moment, felt quiet. Nia closed her fingers around the badge. "Thank you," she said. It was not a small word when she said it. It had everything in it. The October afternoon, and the shaking hands, and the 3 years, and the metal box, and the 4 hard months, and the way her grandmother had stood at the door each morning, checking for cars that shouldn't be there. It had all of it. "Thank you," Elijah said back. The officers left the way they had come, quietly, without ceremony, filing back to their vehicles in the same steady order that had characterized everything about this morning. Mercer was the last to go. He paused at the foot of the porch steps and looked at Ruth with an expression that acknowledged, without words, everything that had been asked of her and everything she had given. Ruth held his gaze. He nodded. She nodded back. And then he was gone, and the street was ordinary again, and the neighbors drifted back to their mornings. And the February light continued its quiet work over Mercer Street in the particular way it always had. Late that afternoon, Nia went out alone. Ruth knew she was going. She stood at the window and watched her granddaughter zip up her coat and walk down the porch steps and turn left on the sidewalk, and she didn't call her back. Nia walked the familiar route, 2 blocks, left at the gas station, past the dry cleaner and the check-cashing place and the laundromat. The streets were quiet in the afternoon quiet way, the light going thin and gold at the edges of buildings. She passed the church. She passed the chain-link lot. She walked until she reached the corner of Clement and Fifth. The bus stop was still there, unchanged, the gray metal bench, the shelter with its missing side panel, the tags layered over tags until the original paint was completely invisible. A stop that served no route anymore. A bench that existed out of habit rather than function. Someone was sitting on it. A woman this time, not a man. Older, bundled in a coat that had been repaired at the sleeve with mismatched thread, her bag on the ground between her feet. She wasn't looking at anyone passing. She was looking at the middle distance the way people looked when they had been sitting somewhere long enough to stop expecting anything from the passing world. Nia slowed. She stood on the sidewalk a few feet from the bench. She was not carrying anything to give. No crackers, no sandwich, no paper wrapping with something important hidden on its other side. She had walked out without thinking about this moment, and now she was in it, and she understood. And in the same bone-deep way she had understood things her whole life without being taught them, that what she was about to do had nothing to do with what she had in her pockets. She took a step toward the bench. The woman looked up. Nia smiled, not the performed smile of someone being polite, but the real one, the small one, the kind that said, "I see you. I'm not going to keep walking." The woman looked at her for a moment with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to read intentions quickly. Then she moved over slightly on the bench. Nia sat down beside her. The February afternoon continued around them. The thin gold light, the distant sound of the city, the familiar smell of the street that Nia had known her whole life. And the two of them sat together on a bench at a bus stop that served no route. On a corner of a neighborhood that the world didn't always notice, and the badge in Nia's coat pocket pressed very lightly against her side. She didn't need to change the world today. She just needed to not walk past. That, she had learned, was where everything started. How many times have we walked past someone who needed us and told ourselves it wasn't our place? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that remind us what ordinary people are truly capable of.